minutes presenting, and it should be followed by 5 minutes for Q's and A's. And if you have any questions, just please leave it in the chat box. And with no further ado, I will start with the first speaker of the day, Professor Eric Miller. So Professor Eric has been a faculty member in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering, University of Toronto since 1983, where he is currently Professor and Founding Director of Mobility Network, the University of Toronto Transit Research Institute. Professor Miller has chaired or been a member of over 50 urban interstate travel demand modeling peer review panels throughout North America, and I can keep going. I will just stop here and I will turn it over to Professor Eric. Professor Eric, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kareem. And so today I'm going to be presenting work in progress for a project that we've been working on with the Transportation Services Division of the City of Toronto for most of this year, following on some previous work with them, looking at trying to make use of really good data available about what the city calls private transportation companies, PTCs, trying to work, as I'll explain, work towards explicitly modeling both the demand and supply within the context of our large regional activity travel demand models, so that we can really dig into some policy questions about PTCs, but looking at how they operate within the overall market. So I'm going to, as usual, I have several too many slides relative to Kareem's instructions, but I will get through them very quickly. I want to make just a few quick definitions, more formally define the objective of the study. And then, as I say, we're trying to bring into the regional travel demand model we use in this region GTA model, the PTC component. So I want to just briefly introduce GTA model. So we see what the context within which we're trying to insert this model. Briefly talk about our conceptualization of the problem, the data, the metrics, and and the sort of policies we're looking to test. So again, from definitions, so the city uses the term PTC. In the U.S. they talk about TNCs, transportation network companies. I think actually the private transportation company is a better moniker for this sort of activity. So it's the Ubers, Lyfts, et cetera, of the world that we're talking about. We think it's very important to differentiate between what we've tend to call ride-hailing, which is a single customer service, which is the dominant mode of PTC services, versus ride-sharing, where the same vehicle might be picking up 2 or 3 customers and dropping them off in some sequence. That's a tough combinatorial problem to handle. We haven't taken that on yet, but also it is, at least in the Toronto context, still a relatively minor component of PTC operations. We have to consider taxi, and then there's taxis, conventional taxi services, the BECs, etc. of the world that are competitors to the PTCs. And again, the city talks about vehicle for hire, which includes both PTC and taxi services, and both are regulated by the city. We're going to focus today on the PTC operations. As we'll show, we have very good data about PTCs. We actually don't have much very good data for taxis, which is an ongoing challenge. So again, as I've already said, but to reiterate, the overall challenge to us is we'd really like to build an explicit model of PTC demand and supply, and by supply we also mean performance, so we can bring it into our travel demand models in the same way that we're currently modeling road usage and transit usage and active transportation. And I firmly believe that if we want to do good policy analysis on PTC, we have, and particularly predicting the demand for PTC. I mean, I'm a demand modeler at my core. We have to understand the supply. How can we say somebody's going to choose PTC if we don't know what the travel times and the wait times and the costs are? So just as we model roadway and transit operations in quite a bit of detail, we really need PTC in the model. So the demand model that we're trying to bring this into is GTA model current version 4.2. It is an activity-based and agent-based microsimulation model of daily out-of-home activity. It is truly an activity-based model. It's been in operational use since 2016. The city started using it in early 2016. It's been gradually adopted by virtually every major transportation agency in the region. The core of GTA model is what we call TASHA, which is the actual activity scheduler. TASHA is what decides what people are going to do today, and then GTA, as we'll show, GTA model is the overall model system within which that scheduler lives. I think a unique feature of Tasha GTA model, which is not the focus here, is that we make use of a probit, multinomial probit random utility tour-based model that we think has significant advantages for understanding the complexity of tour-based travel within the region. Happy to talk about that in questions, but so it's just one of the, I think, the features of it. So GTA model looks like this. In some sense, activity-based models and even trip-based models have a fairly similar general aggregate structure. But in the case of activity-based models, we have to synthesize a population. We have to determine sort of longer-term decisions about how many cars people have, their driver's licenses, where people work, where people go to school. So there's models that deal with all those components. And then that sets us up. We now know everything about the household, their cars, their workplaces, etc., their demographics. And then we go into TASHA, which decides what people are going to do in a given day. It generates all the trips within tours, and then we do the road and transit assignments. So again, what we're trying to do in many respects is insert PTC as part of that component as well. So Tasha runs through. We've in the overall model system, we create a total list, 100% list of synthetic people within synthetic households. And I like to say we wake them up in the morning, we ask them what they were going to do. So we grab each person, each household, and they go through a logical series of steps, deciding what out-of-home activities they want to engage in. We schedule those activities so they are feasible within the day. For non-work school activities, we choose their locations, where you're going to shop. And then once we've built an activity schedule for the day, the trips within tours, home-based tours, I'm going from home to work to shop to home. We decide what the modes are going to be that they use on those trips. And that's where PTC comes in, along with taxi, as possible modes within this mode choice model. And so Tasha, again, we don't have time, but it is an activity schedule modeling. We generate a set of episodes by different, what we call projects, different kinds of activities, and then we build up the schedule today, or from the bottom up organically. So the advantage of this, we believe, is that we don't have to predetermine how complex or the types of schedules, activity patterns, tours people engage in. They emerge organically. For most people, they're very simple tours, but for some people, they may be more complicated. And then once we have these tours, we then go into this tour-based model that in particular is concerned about modeling. If a car leaves the driveway, it has to return home. So we keep track of car usage in a very detailed way. One car can't be used by two people at the same time. And so on. And so we've been finding in operational practice this tour-based model actually works quite well. So that's what we have. How do we start modeling PTC? Again, some definitions. We're trying to differentiate between a mode and a service. So a mode is specifically a vehicle type, an infrastructure network, and a control system technology. So cars are a mode, public transit is a mode, but a service is then a combination of modes or activities that satisfy people's needs. So I need to travel from home to work. A service might be, maybe I can use a bike share to get to the subway station, and I take subway and then walk. So the transit service and the bicycle services combined are moving me from home to work, making use of one or more modes of travel. And the modes show up And we have modal networks. We have a road network, we have a transit network, and so on. And so that's one principle is to try to differentiate between kind of the technology of the modes, the physical ways of moving people, and the services, which are the way we organize those modes to deliver transportation services. We are very much adopting an activity-based approach and a microsimulation approach to model at the level of individual decision makers how they make decisions. And then, so again, we're separating this notion of services from networks. So the PTC, a person deciding to drive from home to work, on their with their private car, that generates a vehicle trip on the road. That mode or service choice generates a vehicle trip on the network. Similarly, if that person decides to use PTC, that actually will generate two vehicle trips. The car, the Uber car, has to come pick them up from someplace and has to take them someplace. So again, the provision of service will generate physical flows by one vehicle or another on the network, and so we have that explicit representation. And again, another type of activity that we have to be dealing with are drivers. PTC, until we get autonomous vehicles running around, a very important agent in this system are the drivers deciding to enter service, leave service, accept rides, and so forth. So part of modeling PTC is actually modeling the behavior of the drivers in terms of how they interact in the system. So we put all these pieces together, and this is what, taking that previous flow chart of GTA model, we really have to be inserting mobility services and eventually mobility as a service, which might be, a platform for combining different kinds of mobility services, bike share with PTCs and so forth, explicitly modeling the fleets that are being, the PTC fleets, and explicitly modeling drivers. And all of these, again, will be showing up as trips on the network. So that's where we're trying to work towards. The data we're using, as I mentioned, the City of Toronto, as part of their licensing agreement with the PTCs, they actually have records of every trip made since 2016, but the level of detail has varied a bit over time, but certainly for the last number of years, we have disaggregated records of every customer served in terms of pickup, drop-off location at a particular time, the fares paid. And over the last few years, at least, we also can track vehicles in an anonymized way. So we know the same vehicle, picked up passenger one, dropped them here, picked up somebody. And so we can actually track drivers or vehicles coming into service and out of service and track their overall trajectory towards the system. So we have quite detailed data. In this study, we just took a little slice the early 2020 pre-pandemic to look at, just trying to understand sort of what the system looked like before the pandemic. But there is data right up to today if we want it. So just to give you a flavor of the sort of data, we can look at the demand, the usage of the system by day of the week, by hour within the day. We have weekday and weekend data, so we can see the sort of patterns that occur. Make some sense. Friday, Saturdays are the big days, but we also see morning and afternoon peak period usage for work trips. PTCs are used for work. It's not just to get you home from the bar on a Friday night. We can look at the spatial distributions by time period of ODs. So, here we're plotting the trips. The thing that pops out is clearly the downtown is, sorry, I've got to get my cursor in the right spot. The downtown is clearly, a major focus of trips, both within it and to and from. But something that, was obvious after we saw it is the airport. Pearson Airport is also a major generator of traffic to and from, and we actually model airport trips explicitly with the process. We had to update our mode choice model for airport trips as well. And then we can also look at, the more detailed temporal maps. These are complicated, but the horizontal axis here is time of day. The vertical axis is day of the week. And, the hot spots show where there's higher, we can plot how long on average passengers wait, the trip durations, how long people are traveling, trip distance, time, distance, and what they're paying. And so we can see, the variation by day of week week and over time. So again, very detailed data to do some modeling with. The metrics that, one advantage of having these sorts of big regional travel demand models is we can generate a lot of outputs that can be of policy interest. Obviously, we're generating PTC ridership in space, time, day of the week. GTA model is a weekday model. We can't do weekend modeling within the model at the moment. We can look at the big interest of the city is impact on transit ridership. How is PTC complementing or in particular competing with transit? Another big issue is the vehicle kilometers traveled. How much, there's a lot of discussion about congestion and emissions coming out of the PTC, and if we got rid of PTC, would life be better? We can explore those issues and associated with VKT as congestion, emissions. We're working with Professor Hatzapula's group to translate the VKTs the models are generating into emissions. We can look at the wait times, which is a major level of service metric for customers. We can look at what's happening to travel times by different modes. So we can look at, how the fares, the revenues, but also the costs of usage. And, and we can quantify, what's going on the supply side in terms of number of drivers or vehicles in the system at any point in time, how they distribute over space and so on. The immediate motivation of this is there's a few, the city transportation service is very interested in, addressing this question of what is the PTC impact on transit ridership. There's a lot of debate about restricting the fleet size. What would be the impacts on that? It's not as obvious as it might seem in terms of whether it would reduce, congestion. If you reduce PTC, maybe more people would drive. Eventually looking at different fare policies. And to look at this, we're doing various scenario testing. We have a base case as sort of a very first order assessment of impact on transit. We running a scenario where we blow PTC away, it doesn't exist, and we see how many people shift to transit as sort of a first order measure of, possibly how much of that transit market is being diverted to PTC. We will be looking at, it's non-trivial to look at how you would model a reduced PTC fleet, but we're looking at that and fare policy. So these are the immediate things. I think there's many things we can be doing. Unfortunately, having talked about all this, we're not yet in a position to actually present results, partially because we're still processing some things, but also these results haven't been seen by council, and so we're not going to preempt transportation services presentation to council eventually about some of these things. So stay tuned in terms of results. And so I almost stuck to my 15 minutes. So I'm happy to take. Thank you for your attention and answer any quick questions we have before we have to move on. So thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Professor Eric. Right. Yeah, I think we have a question in the chat box. So is there a way to infer the extent to which BTCs are carrying people that have abandoned public transit? For example, can you correlate BTC trip data with transit service reliability at a local level?
Okay, so the reliability is a big question. So at the moment, I would say GTA model does not, and the ME transit assignment network model does not have a reliability explicitly in any way, shape, or form. The buses are running on time to schedule in the model. This is an area of very active conversation with Professor Shalaby, who, as you well know, has a big interest in reliability issues, and so we are I would say early days work looking at how we could actually start, first of all, define what do we mean by reliability that we could metrics that we could bring into the model, and then how that might filter through mode choice and route choice and that sort of thing. So that's it's a great question. I think it's where we have to go. I think one of the big gaps in these sort of, in a sense, conventional models is we're not handling transit reliability, and I think we have to do better there.
All right, any other questions? Yeah, can the TTC not provide service delay statistics? a question from Michael.
Well, yeah. There's a fair bit of information out there. Again, Professor Shelby can talk better about some of these things. So the TTC has metrics about buses running late and these sorts of things. But to bring that information into a model, we have to first of all be able to simulate delays or something. And right now, we're using Emmy as a transit assignment, and it's a deterministic, essentially from a performance point of view, it's a deterministic model. So, so I think we have to get into, how do we bring at least some stochasticity, some variability, and hence some generation of delay into the model. We then have to understand how people perceive delay or reliability and how that affects their choices. So I mean, people don't know about standard deviations or something, so what are good metrics that affect demand? So I think this is a really interesting both demand and supply modeling question that it's tough. And so that's why people haven't maybe looked at it as much as they might. I'm trying to find out how to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, it should be up on the screen. You can stop sharing up.
Yeah, I'm having trouble getting the little screen sharing thing to come
Yeah,
up where I can click on it. Uh,
I think also we have one final question.
okay.
Yeah, Professor Bahir is asking if every private car trip is replaced by two BTC trips, does that increase demand significantly? And what to do about that?
Well, this is one of the critical questions, and that's something that one of the reasons we're trying to build this model so that, yeah, if you well, whether it's a transit trip or an auto drive trip, so let's say an auto drive trip, there's always two, essentially there's always two PTC trips to replace that. So that's why in theory, the belief is that PTC increases congestion. And I think without giving away too much, I mean, in our modeling, we do see, a PTC effect on congestion. Um, but how big it is and how critical that is in the scheme of things, I think we're still trying to sort out. And again, I think the other thing which we have to get into eventually is the ride sharing. A lot of the argument for PTC type services, particularly if you get into AVs, is that where the efficiencies come from is if you had kind of almost universal ride sharing. But I think there's a lot of questions about the demand for that and how universally acceptable that way, and then even just how efficient that is. Having optimal allocations of vehicles to do ride sharing that is still providing a good level of service to people while being cost effective, I think is still a fairly open question.
Yeah, maybe one final question before we move on. So Brandon is asking, does the value of time a factor in the model? If so, I feel value of time has been increasing in recent year when one sees people using PCs to get to the subway stations instead of buses.
Well, there's certainly values of time throughout the model. So the mode choice models are being driven to a fair extent by values of time, time cost trade-offs. The route assignment models in both auto and transit have values of time in them. Those are calibrated values of time based on past data. So, again, I think it's a good question is to what extent have our values of time changing. There are examples, I think, for example, in the UK, where people actually in the models adjust value of time for income changes, real income changes over time. That's something we're not doing at the moment. But again, I think it's an area for research.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Eric. I will Now we will move to the second speaker, and the second speaker is Mwendwa Kiko, and Mwendwa is a third-year PhD student at the University of Toronto. His main research interest is modeling of the land use transport interaction, and his thesis topic is modeling of vehicle transactions for an integrated transport and land use model. And Mwendwa will present electric vehicles and gas stations insights from a travel demand model. Mwendwa, over to you.
Yes, hi everyone. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Karim. I will be presenting the work that I carried out together with my supervisor, Professor Eric, who literally just presented. Hi, Professor. Yeah, let's get started. First and foremost, a bit of background. The number of electric vehicles has been growing very fast for the past few years, as you can see in the graph right in front of you. The statistics displayed here are from the StatScan website's new motor vehicle registrations for personal vehicles only. What we can see is that the number of EVs is increasing, but also that the rate of increase is also increasing. So that increasing rate of increase, a bit of a tongue twister, is the basis for the adoption curves that I will estimate later on. Just a caveat, the graph that you see here is for the whole of Canada, but in my study I'll focus just on the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area municipalities, because that's the area covered by the original travel demand model we're using, which Professor Eric explained to you all 2 seconds ago. And it's also the area for which we were able to obtain the gas station data that we will be using. Okay, so turning our attention to the second aspect of the study, which is the fuel retail industry. Some things jump out. First and foremost, the number of gas stations has declined significantly in both Canada and the US since the 90s. Several reasons have been suggested for this decline, including increased competition, stricter environmental regulations, shrinking profit margins, etc. I'd like to highlight the last point, the low profit margins. The figures that I was seeing was around 2% gross profit margin for the fuel retail industry, compared with something like 30% for banking. And another aspect that's interesting is that it's not a very concentrated industry. So the top 4 fuel retail industry companies control about half the market, which can be contrasted with, for example, supermarkets, where the top 3 players control about 61% of stores. So these factors that I'm mentioning don't enter directly into our study, but they do affect the resilience of the fuel retail industry and the ability of gas stations to, for example, install fast chargers. Now, there is some anecdotal evidence that large numbers of gas stations are, for example, closing in places like Norway, where over 80% of new vehicle sales are battery electric or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. But yeah, that's anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt. Essentially, the conceptual framework we're operating in is that as the increase in as larger numbers of electric vehicles are adopted by consumers, there'll be less need to refuel by internal combustion engine vehicles, and this reduction in refueling puts gas stations in a tricky position because, as we've mentioned, low margin industry, they don't have huge cash reserves. They will find it hard to adapt by installing fast chargers. And also other businesses like coffee shops and supermarkets will be able to adopt fast chargers much more easily. And so many gas stations might end up closing. And that will make it less convenient to use internal combustion engine vehicles, which will further accelerate this cycle. And in this study that I'm going to present here, we're specifically focusing on the effect of increased EV numbers on ICEV, on internal combustion engine vehicle refueling. So with all that in mind, the objectives of what we're going to do are first and foremost to calibrate new EV adoption curves for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area municipalities. So we're considering the 25 municipalities, but specifically the 49 census subdivisions that make them up. And we're using EV adoption data since 2017. Secondly, to test the effect of this EV adoption on the retail fuel industry. using the GTA model, which I just presented. So turning our attention to our data, our area of study is, of course, the GTHA, which is the largest population employment center in Canada. And we considered the about 1,200 gas stations that are found within it. Next, in terms of our refueling behavior, the data source that we used was the Toronto Household Activity and Travel Survey, which was carried out by several of my colleagues in the summer of last year. We collected activity and travel diary information, as well as household and individual sociodemographics and GPS traces. We have data for about 1,000 individuals from about 350 households who started the process, so installed the application, and about 900 individuals from about 260 households who completed all the surveys, the 7 daily surveys. So what are the methods that we'll be using? So first and foremost, our adoption curves, which are derived from diffusion of innovation theory, which is concerned with how the spread of information drives the spread of an innovation. It assumes that a user will adopt a new, better technology when they learn about its existence, and then they're able to spread this technology to others. So at the beginning, it's exponential as people encounter more and more people who haven't adopted the innovation, but then after a while, they're only meeting people who have adopted it. So saturation takes place, and that slows down the process. So even though in the first graph, I showed the statistics for both battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Here, we're just focusing on battery electric vehicles because the impact on gas stations is obvious. People will not refuel. Also, I'd like to highlight the fact that just knowing the EV adoption rates for each census subdivision gives us a lot of information. If people didn't move outside of their CSD, that would be enough to tell us the effect of EV adoption on the fuel retail industry. The problem is people do move out of their census subdivision. They travel, and the rate at which they refuel varies from region to region depending on what activity they're doing in each region, because it varies with the purpose of each trip that they take. So in order for us to actually tell the effect of the transition on the fuel retail industry, we have to model the travel as well. So how are we going to model the travel? With the GTA model, which has at its heart Tasha, and is embedded within the wider model system. Now, this is exactly the same model that Professor Eric just presented a few minutes ago, just slightly different illustration. Refueling trips are not normally modeled within the GTA model, so we needed to introduce a module to do this. Recognizing that people are more likely to refuel during some kinds of trips as opposed to others, what we did is we generated gas station trips with a probability depending on the trip purpose, and then we assigned them to the nearest gas station to the destination of the trip. And we also introduced a capacity to each gas station so that we could have a more spatially realistic distribution of trips to gas stations. So what are the results we obtained? First and foremost, EV adoption. So the maps that you see here show the EV adoption rates for 2030 and 2035, which are the simulation years that we chose for the study. It's the first thing I'd like to highlight is we assume the rate of vehicle ownership doesn't change between now and 2035. We see the highest EV adoption in the northwest of the GTHA, driven by a high number of registrations and a low vehicle ownership level. So, based on these EV adoption rates for the different census subdivisions, we defined several scenarios. So there are essentially 3 families of scenarios for each of the 2 test years, 2030 and 2035. I'm not considering current because it's not really a scenario. There's the most likely scenario where each census subdivision is allocated its EV adoption rate. There's the max scenario where the highest EV adoption rate observed for that test year is allocated to all the census subdivisions. And then there's the minimum scenario where it's the lowest EV adoption rate observed. And essentially what we're doing here is kind of a sensitivity analysis to try and see, try and ask ourselves, what if the factors accelerating or slowing down the EV adoption in some areas would apply everywhere? So the results of the scenarios that we simulated, first and foremost, for the entire GTHA, are displayed in this graph that you see here. So each box plot shows the number of visits to each gas station in each scenario per day for one of the scenarios. The box plot on the far left shows the current scenario, and they run from 2030 minimum to 2035 maximum from left to right. One of the things you can see is the capacity constraint that we introduced. You can see it's by the absence of, by the top of the first four box plots. The story here is that there isn't a complete collapse of demand, even in the 2035 maximum scenario. But a lot of stations do see their demand go to zero, even in the presence of capacity constraints on the stations. And those ones are likely to be very vulnerable to closure. That's essentially the big story that we see here. Looking at how this effect is distributed across space, we're going to show the maps of the effect of the 2030 likely and 2035 likely scenarios next. So this shows the 2030 likely compared to the current. And on the left, I've just put the map that we showed earlier, which shows the percentage of battery electric vehicles in 2030. And on the right is the reduction in visits compared to the current. What we see is that the two follow a similar pattern, but it's not identical. And one potential reason why this is the case is that we see areas that are major population centers, but not activity centers. So they see perhaps less of a reduction in visits than their reduction in internal combustion engine vehicle numbers. But yeah, further investigation would be needed to ascertain why exactly this is what we see. 2035 compared to 2030, compared to current, it's the same story. So what are the key takeaways from everything I've just presented? Well, first and foremost is that we do see a pretty significant reduction in visits being driven primarily, I think we can say, by the increasing rates of electrification and how they vary from one region to another. But also just travel and the different activity locations are also play a significant role. And that the fuel retail industry is likely going to be hit pretty hard by this transition and by this reduction. So that's the first big takeaway. Second big takeaway is that there is a lot of geographic variability in EV adoption, and hence there's a lot of geographic variability in the effect that we're going to see, and that might impact the kinds of steps that policymakers might want to take in the face of this situation. So what are some of the next steps that we might want to take? First and foremost, just enhancing the EV analysis by considering factors influencing the adoption. Because again, what we presented, the model that we use here is very mechanistic. It doesn't interrogate why adoption rates are what they are. It takes them as a given. So having something that considers the influence on, for example, policies and household and individual social demographics on those adoption rates would be a step forward. Secondly, consider how the fuel retail industry might react to this. There are several different possible responses that could be seen, such as consolidation. They might close down unprofitable locations and consolidate. Also, just by improving the user experience, making gas stations nicer, places you might want to spend more time, and be able to interact more as you charge your EV, because that's what the future scenario might look like. And one final question is whether gas stations will ever be allowed to sell electricity. The current regulations essentially prohibit that. It currently only really allows utilities to sell electricity by measurement, the way gasoline is sold by measurement. So yes, will regulations change to allow gas stations to sell electricity the way they sell gasoline? With all that said, I'd like to open it up for questions, but first thank Dr. Michael Rushlow, who funded this research through his generous donation to the Mobility Network at the University of Toronto. And I do thank Dr. Rushlow, who I think is here, for his generous contribution. That being said, I am open to any questions.
All right, thank you, Mwendwa. I think we have a question from Professor Baher. He is asking, why is EV adoption rate in Norway is much higher than here? Are there government policies that are inducing such high rates that we can learn from?
Thank you very much. So Norway has had higher EV adoption rates for a long time now. I believe driven largely by tax breaks and other incentives. I'm not completely sure of the exact details, but there is a fiscal structure around getting people to adopt EVs that has driven them to adopt EVs. Also, the government was very supportive of the EV transition from the very beginning because Norway's electricity mix is very green. So it's one of the countries, I believe it's around almost over 95% is from hydroelectric power. So it's one of the countries where the impact of switching to EVs is most significant, because if you don't have a very green electricity mix, then even if you transition people to EVs, you're just pushing the emissions from taking place on the road with the cars to taking place at the power plant where the extra electricity is produced. But yes, I believe it was fiscal incentives like tax breaks.
Yeah, I think Professor Baher has a follow-up question. He is asking, EV range is increasing rapidly. Are you taking this in your forecasts?
That's a question. Perhaps it would come into, well, yes, that is a very good question, because one of the assumptions that the diffusion of innovation theory makes and the adoption curves that we're using make is that the technology is constant. So all the adoption is being driven by information spread. So people telling other people about the technology. But what we're seeing with EVs is the technology itself is improving, and that would further accelerate the rate of adoption. So it isn't something that we're currently taking into account, and it's something that we probably should, because it would impact how adoption takes place.
All right, maybe one final question. So Dr. Michael is asking, great work. What is the fuel supply industry's behavior in lobbying for approval to distribute electricity?
I wasn't able to get much information about what's happening here in Canada. I know in the US, there's a big fight between essentially the electricity lobby and the fuel industry lobby about whether or not they should be allowed to sell electricity, and whether or not, like, who should benefit from the enormous, I think it's the Inflation Reduction Act, that gave a huge number of subsidies for the construction of charging stations. And as far as I can tell, at least in the US, it's unclear whether regulation will change or not. It looks like essentially the funds are going to go to anyone who can build a charging station, and there won't be a preference for fuel retail stations, for gas stations. Here in Canada, I wasn't able to get much info about what exactly is going on in the regulatory space, but also we don't really have the same Inflation Reduction Act type subsidy that's come in. We have similar things, but the volume isn't as big. So maybe the gas station industry and the utility industry haven't gotten their claws out yet. Yeah. Okay, let me stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
so much, Mwendwa. And now we will move to our third speaker. So our third speaker is Fleta Ong, and she is a PhD candidate supervised by Professor Habib. Her research interests include the use of shared mobility services and the new vehicle technologies such as autonomous and electric vehicles, on her spare time, she likes to swim. And Felita will present electric vehicles, preference for additional versus replacement household vehicles. Felita, over to you.
Thank you, Kareem. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can, but I can't hear you clearly.
Okay. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, it's better now.
Okay. Okay, I have to use my earphones. All right. Hi everyone. I'm also going to be talking about EVs today, but the focus of my presentation will be on how preferences for electric vehicles would differ between households looking to purchase an additional vehicle versus households looking to replace an existing internal combustion engine vehicle. So this study was done in collaboration with Mashur, who's postdoc jointly appointed by Professor Habib as well as Professor Moataz from McMaster University. And Professor Moataz actually did the data collection for this study. So as Kiko mentioned, electric vehicle adoption is on the rise in Canada and globally as well. And globally, EVs make up about 1/5 of new vehicle registrations in 2023, whereas in Canada, the proportion of plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicle. So these two are considered as zero emission vehicles or ZEVs. They reached double digits for the first time in 2023, and they make up about 11% of all new vehicle registrations in Canada. While Canada is lagging behind countries like China or Norway, we do have targets to accelerate EV adoption, including having all new light-duty vehicle sales be zero-emission vehicles by 2035, I believe. And so, given this background, EV adoption is expected to continue growing in the coming years. And with this trend, there is a need to understand the factors influencing EV adoption. And a lot of studies actually have looked into the factors that influence EV adoption. And these factors can generally be categorized into vehicle attributes. So things like size of the vehicle, driving range, whether it's gasoline range or electric range, the price of the vehicle, as well as charging infrastructure, so availability of public charging and availability of charging at home or at work, as well as the charging speed, whether it's a fast charger, level 1 or level 2, and incentives, whether it's monetary incentive like tax rebates or tax reductions or one-time rebates, or policy incentives, so access to HOV lanes or bus lanes. And last but not least, we also have socio-demographic attributes, so things like age, educational attainment, household size, residence location, and home ownership status. So a lot of studies have definitely looked into the factors influencing EV adoption, but very few, if any, have looked into how EV adoption would vary by transaction type. And by transaction type, I mean whether an EV is acquired to replace an existing vehicle or whether it's acquired to expand a vehicle fleet. And so this is really the focus of our study. And the questions that we want to answer are how would the factors that influence EV adoption differ based on these transaction types, and the extent, and how would the extent to which these factors influence EV adoption also differ based on transaction type. So to conduct our analysis, we use survey data. As I mentioned earlier, Professor Moataz's team conducted the survey, which was done online, and the target population was Canadian households planning to lease or purchase a vehicle in the next 3 years, so relatively soon. And after we filtered and cleaned the data set, our sample size was around was 11,423 households who did not own an EV at the time of the survey. And in the survey, we also asked respondents to state whether they're looking to purchase an additional vehicle or whether they're looking to replace a vehicle. And a large majority of the sample did state that they were trying to replace an existing vehicle. Only about 7% or 800 households intended to purchase an additional vehicle. But for the purpose of our analysis, this sample size is okay. It's large enough. So a key component of the survey is the stated preference experiment, where we presented a scenario to the respondents. We gave them 4 different powertrains, so internal combustion engine vehicle, hybrid electric vehicle, plug-in hybrid, and battery electric vehicle option, as well as a set of attributes that characterize these options. And we asked the respondents to state their preferred powertrain for each scenario, and each respondent were given 6 scenarios. The idea is to capture the trade-offs that these respondents make while making their vehicle choice decisions. And using the stated preference data set, we developed a discrete choice model called the mixed logit model. In brief, the model allows us to capture variations or heterogeneity in preferences, as well as substitutional patterns between different alternatives or different vehicle powertrains. We developed one model for the subsample of households looking to replace a conventional vehicle, or more specifically, an internal combustion engine vehicle, and another model for the subsample of households looking to expand their vehicle fleet. So the nesting structure, or the model structure, is shown here. The model structure shows 2 nests, one being the conventional vehicle nest and another one being the electric vehicle nest. The ICEV and HEV options belong to the conventional vehicle nest, and the HEV, PHEV, and BEV options belong to the electric vehicle nest. What the nesting structure shows is that there's cross nesting, and with the HEV option being cross-nested, and within the nest, it shows that with the ICEV option is more likely to be the ICEV and HEV options are more likely to be substituted with one another than the So we have the same nesting structure for both models. And in terms of our key findings, what I'll show in this table soon is how each of these attributes influence the factors have the expected effect. So, for instance, price and operating cost have a negative influence on EV adoption across the board, whether whether an EV is supposed to replace an existing vehicle or acquired as an additional vehicle. On the other hand, cash incentives have also have a positive influence. In terms of fast charging, and keep in mind that I'm just showing a portion of our final model because we have a lot more variables in our model. I'm just picking out a few of the most important ones. So yeah, in terms of fast charging, we found that it's positive for plug-in hybrid and battery electric for replacement vehicle, but they're not significant for the additional model. Additional vehicle model. And this could be due to the relatively lower sample size, but it could also suggest that public charging attributes are not as important in the consideration of purchasing an EV as an additional vehicle because of the availability of other vehicles in the household. On the other hand, public charging quality becomes essential when an EV is purchased to replace an ICE EV, especially if the household owns a single vehicle. In terms of electric range, we again found a positive influence as expected. In the case of plug-in hybrid as an additional vehicle, we actually found a nonlinear relationship where a range of up to 100 kilometers is preferred for plug-in hybrid. Beyond this, the propensity to choose plug-in hybrid as an additional vehicle is negatively influenced, and this could stem from the preference to use plug-in hybrids as for short distance, maybe intra-city trips rather than longer distance trips. In terms of sociodemographics, our results are mostly in alignment with the results of previous studies. We found that in general, younger adults with higher income and higher educational attainment, as well as homeowners rather than renters, are more likely to adopt EVs. But for multi-vehicle households, we found difference in the impact of this attribute in buying an EV, a plug-in hybrid, as a replacement vehicle versus an additional vehicle. And so this again emphasizes the need to perhaps incorporate transaction type into our studies looking into EV adoption factors. So using some of the estimated parameters from the model, we were able to compute the willingness to pay for different attributes. In this slide, we computed the willingness to pay for cash incentives, or in other words, how much cash incentives are valued by the respondents. Because of the nature of the model, we were also able to compute a distribution for the willingness to pay rather than a single fixed value. And these charts essentially show that cash incentives are on average valued less by households looking for an additional vehicle rather than households looking for a replacement vehicle. The dotted lines here represent the average value. This could be because of budgetary constraints, but more work is needed to look into specifically why this is the case. But yeah, even though we have slightly different averages, we see that in general, the distribution or the shape of the curve of the willingness to pay for cash incentives is pretty similar regardless of EV type and regardless of transaction type. So in terms of monthly operating costs, we can observe both similarities and differences between the two models. Both models show that households are least sensitive to plug-in hybrid operating costs. We see that on average, the values are less negative compared to BEV and the HEV options. But the households diverge on the type of powertrain as well as the operating costs that they are most sensitive to. So households replacing ICE EV are most sensitive towards BEV costs, whereas households expanding their fleet are most sensitive to hybrid electric vehicle operating costs. And the willingness to pay distribution for BEV as well as PHEV operating costs are also different shape-wise, which again highlights difference in preferences across these two transaction types. So some key takeaways. First is that our models show that there's heterogeneity in preferences towards different powertrains, including towards EVs. We also found that transaction type contributes to this heterogeneity and also the sensitivity towards different factors in EV adoption. And we found that there were fewer restrictions or fewer factors in consideration when a household is purchasing an EV as an additional vehicle rather than as a replacement vehicle. In terms of limitations, stated preference data may suffer from hypothetical bias. So that means that respondents' stated choices may differ from their choices in real life. And in terms of future work, perhaps attitudinal variables can be incorporated in the model. Past studies have noted that attitudes towards technology or the environment have a significant influence in EV adoption. And we also need to continue collecting data to gain further insights into EV adoption and preferences. We can continue collecting preference data at different snapshots of time to be able to understand how preferences evolve over time. And we can also collect travel diaries, for example, a week-long travel diary like the one Kiko mentioned, or in this case, Professor Habib's also trying to develop a tool in which we can through which we can conveniently collect activity travel diary through a smartphone. And through this type of data, we can uncover travel patterns and how these travel patterns can influence EV adoption. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Please leave your questions in the chat box. I think we have our first question from Michael, Dr. Michael. He is asking, is there any research into the extent to which trying EV rebates to provide scrappage of an ICE vehicle would influence the consumer decisions?
Is there research into EV? Oops. EV rebates trying to... Not quite sure I understand.
He has a follow-up question, maybe.
Oh, okay, yeah. Is there any information on what happens to the ICV being replaced by EVs? Presumably they're not scrapped, so the overall fleet is still increased, even though the vehicle may be replaced within an individual. Yeah, that's actually a good point. Not all vehicles being scrapped might be replaced. They might be bought by another household, right? We do not actually have that information on our survey, but that is definitely a good point to include in future surveys, which we will be doing another EV related survey most likely this early winter, probably early next year, I mean. And so it's something that we probably want to capture so that we can do this a similar analysis with more information and hopefully with a bigger sample size in terms of like the households trying to have an additional vehicle. The first question, tying EV rebates to verified scrappage. Yeah, again, we don't really have that information. And I should also point out that the survey was done a few years ago before, well, in the beginning of when EV adoptions were really kind of increasing. So at that point, yeah, things might be most likely will be different than the factors that influence adoption currently. Hopefully, I answered the question. Oh, cash incentives are not currently tied to scrappage. Oh, I see. I wonder how that would change things. Yeah, I mean, so if cash incentives are I guess, are you asking if cash incentives are only given for people who are not going to discard their vehicle, or are you? I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, maybe he can unmute. Like, I will let him speak if.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Um. So
Yeah,
cash. Uh-huh.
maybe we can move over. You can,
I'll
yeah,
try to type my answer on the chat.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. So
Thank you.
now we will move to the final speaker of this session, and we have Kylie Wang. Kylie Wang is currently a fourth year PhD student in transportation engineering at the University of Toronto. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Toronto. Kylie's current research focuses on exploring the intricacies of travel behavior modeling, travel survey methodology, and the impact of emerging technologies on travel demand. And Kylie will present week-long activity-based travel demand modeling, responding to the new reality of post-COVID urban travel demands. Kylie, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Can you guys hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So today I will be presenting a research on the week-long activity-based travel demand model that captures urban travel demand. And this work was conducted under the supervision of Professor Habib. So let's begin. So here is an outline of my presentation. I will start with an introduction to why multi-day ABMs are necessary. Then I will walk you through the data source we used. And then after that, I will discuss two case studies to highlight the importance of looking at activity travel behaviors through the multi-day perspective. The first case studies explore the day-to-day variations in travel patterns. And then the second examines the interactivity durations modeling. And then we will conclude the presentation with a summary and next steps in our research. So first of all, this is a slide on what is ABM, but I don't think I have to reiterate that much because the previous presentation is all about activity-based models. In general, ABMs are based on the concept that traveling is a derived demand for activity participation, and typical ABMs models are choices like activity type choice, duration choice, destination location choice, and also travel mode choice. So currently, most of the state-of-art ABMs rely on the typical day assumption. This means that most of them and pretty much all of them are a single day model. So this is an ad hoc approach due to data availability constraints because in the good old days, travel surveys are being done by self-reported either on pen or pencil or it's a web form. So it is very, very difficult to collect multi-day information in an accurate manner. So, however, this typical day assumption has been challenged heavily by empirical studies. And constrained ABMs to a single day will remove their ability to analyze the dynamics of activity scheduling and also behaviors such as information flow, memory, state dependency, and also behavior that is beyond 24 hours time frame. Because in reality, we all know that we all arrange our day schedules based on what we are going to do on different days, and this is referred to as intrapersonal variability in the literature. So understanding day-to-day variation in travel behavior is critical for planning purposes, and this is particularly relevant when considering policies like work from home, which impact travel patterns across different days. By capturing those dynamics, the next generation of ABMs could offer a realistic approach to policy evaluation. And then I will talk about the data. So needless to say, observation for multi-day behaviors are required for multi-day analysis. And today, smartphone-based applications and surveys are suitable for this kind of task. And there is a number of proprietary and commercial-driven smartphone-based applications available on the market to collect and track people for multiple days. And right now, our group is currently developing our own smartphone-based application called Tracy Move. In the meantime, Google Timeline data also complement this, offering travel histories. So in this presentation, I will present 2 case studies using Google location data. So last year, our group successfully collected Google location history data and captures week-long travel diary for over 900 individuals. And this is totaling over more than 50,000 events and also more than 20,000 individual trips. So the average trip rates we collected was around 3.25 trips per day, and the number increased to 3.97 if we exclude immobile individuals. So this data set provides a robust foundation for us to understand the multi-day travel behavior. And then I will discuss 2 case studies on a very high level to highlight the importance of look at travel demand from a multi-day perspective. Our first case study examines the day-to-day variability in activity travel patterns, and this will provide insights into how individuals balance their out-from-home travel throughout the week and also consider the adoption of ICT technologies on the daily life. So the data set showed that the trip rate varies significantly throughout each day of the week. So we can observe a pretty clear trend that the trip rate was the lowest on Monday and then increased gradually and peaked on Saturday. And this tells us 2 things. First of all, right now, the most congested day is Saturday, is weekend. It's not the weekday peak period that our conventional models that we're looking at. So don't be surprised if you caught into congestion on Saturday. This is the post-COVID new norm. And the second thing is pretty clear that this disproves the typical day assumption, because every day is different. There is no typical day exist, and we schedule and live each day of the week differently. So theoretically speaking, we can categorize variability into interpersonal, which reflects the difference between individuals, and also intrapersonal, which representing the daily fluctuations within an individual's schedule. And the conventional single-day ABMs can only look at the interpersonal variability through the social demographic variables they included in the model. So they look at how different types of people act differently. However, we need to a holistic approach. We need to consider both intra and interpersonal variability in our ABM analysis. And then this is the mathematical derivation of inter and intrapersonal variability from the equation of total variability. And it's very neat, but I think I need to go over that in detail in this presentation. So our empirical study showed that the day-to-day variability for trip rate, which is directly reflect the travel demand, account for 90% of the total variation. So our trip rate variability is significantly intrapersonal. On the other hand, our mode choice variability is interpersonal, which means difference in our socio-economic variables differed our mode choice behavior. And also our travel time variability and also travel distance variability are largely intrapersonal. And we also use box-cox regression to try to find the impact of exogenous variables on those variability measurements. And the results shows that individuals who exclusively commute to work has more stable trip rate patterns. On the other hand, that is saying that individuals who can work from home at telecommuting they are generating more variations in their daily travel patterns. And the regression also shows that multimodality is negatively correlated with higher travel demand, but positively correlated with higher education levels. This is saying if someone has to travel a lot throughout the week, they have the tendency to stick with a single mode. They are familiar with the most. However, if an individual is highly educated, they sort of know to use different travel modes for different purposes. And in the second study, we modeled individuals' interactivity durations with their travel modes. So the interactivity durations is not the duration of the activity itself, it's the duration between the individuals schedule the same activities on their weekly timeline. And also we also capture the correlation of that with their mode choice behavior. So the interactivity duration is modeled using accelerated failure time model, and the mode choice model is modeled using MNL, and we use the copular approach. So they are the error term is assumed to be correlated, and then we use least transformation to capture the correlation. So our findings show that mandatory activities like work or study have shorter intervals, and discretionary activities are less frequently scheduled. This is as expected. So for the mode choice, we also analyzed the patterns for different activity types. We found that private vehicles dominate most categories, especially for mandatory activities. Public transit is used more for work or study, and also walking is common for errands and eating out. The copular model's variance and correlation patterns show that mobility utility impacts individuals' interactivity duration. For instance, the retail and service activities correlated strongly with higher mobility utilities, meaning that those activities are scheduled more frequently for individuals who have higher mobility utilities, means they have generally higher utility and also higher access to mobility tools. They will have the tendencies to participate more discretionary activities during a weekly time span. However, for mandatory activities, individuals has to schedule them irrespective of what mobility tools they have. So in summary, those two studies demonstrate the depth and richness of behavior insights gained from a multi-day perspective. The empirical findings tell us that 90% of the travel demand variables are intrapersonal and urge us to develop an operational multi-day ABMs. So the first task is to ensure sufficient and reliable multi-day dataset can be collected to feed multi-day ABMs. So our tracing move app is in its final stage of algorithm development, and it will be scheduled for completion between September and November 2024. So with this app in operation, we will have a steady supply of observations and multi-day dataset to feed our ABMs. And we are also building the custom week model. Custom is a full-fledged ABM systems. The custom week is a fully econometric ABMs framework that incorporates those insights we presented today to model weekly travel behaviors. So the custom week model is still under development. So I don't have lots of things to share today, but we will update you guys once we have an operational custom week model. And thank you for your attention. This is all my presentation, and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I think we have a question from Professor Paher.
All right, thank you very much. If I heard correctly, you said that weekend trips are more frequent than weekdays, implying that weekend congestion is heavier than weekdays congestion. Is this correct
Yes.
in your model?
So our data shows, it's not our model, it's data, shows the
Yeah.
most congested day is Saturday. And I saw Professor Miller's slides. The Uber data also shows the same thing. The most Uber trips happens on Saturday.
Yeah, but this is extremely serious because we've always hypothesized that weekday congestion is addressable by commuter rail, like GO Transit, subways, even LRT, and so on. But weekend trips, what is the nature of those trips? Obviously, they are not work trips, and it's not a single vehicle, so probably you have family trips and whatnot. So they are much less amenable to transit usage. Are we sure of all of this? Like if we see,
We are pretty sure Saturday is the most congested day, and we're also aware of so the transit crisis you mentioned about. So they are actually facing a structural change in the post-pandemic world. So they have to prepare for this structural change instead of just dragging people back to work and expecting they will feed the transit systems.
so what would be the solution then, in your opinion, for weekend congestion? Because we're back to building roads, which is a direction that we don't want to move towards.
So my personal opinion, we have to think about our transit system, what's their mandate? Because for the world before COVID, the transit system, the biggest mandate is moving people to work. Maybe that's we should think about differently for weekends, and also think about how our transit system will move people for a variety of purposes, not just moving people to downtown to work. And also the price structure can also be changed. Right now in Toronto, we only have like single flat price systems. Can that be adjusted to attract more people to use transit systems for discretionary purposes? Is it possible? Because discretionary activities has different value of time than the working activities. So all of that has to be systematically reviewed and also changed. And that's actually another research papers that we are working on at the moment.
Yeah, a last comment, and I'll stop. Like, for example, you notice clearly that like Highway 400, for instance, would be very busy on the weekend, especially in the, going to the cottage season, and also the QW going to Niagara Falls is very congested on the weekend, and you cannot serve those by transit. So, like, you're not going to take transit to go to the cottage, right? So I'm not sure what the solution is then, other than road expansion, which is not a good direction to go to. So I'm wondering if you have a take on this, like, because transit pricing is not going to take me to that cottage, even if you
For
make it
sure, for
free.
sure. So at some point, maybe we need to think about the investment in our infrastructure and the capacity, because as Felita or other people are presenting, so autonomous vehicles is coming, and they are autonomous vehicles, so they will, at the end of the day, they will use our road capacities. So how to take the balance? Or should we just keep our narratives on our war on cars, or should we think a more balanced approach, prepare our infrastructure for serve all purposes, including traveling to the lake area for cottages? Are we ready for that future? So that's an very like broad topics to think about.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Professor Bahar. Please feel free to ask a question. If you have a question, just raise your hand or please write it in the chat box.
And since nobody's asking questions, so I'm going to ask another one if you don't mind, Karim.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay,
Sure.
so yeah, Kylie, you said that, for instance, the average number of trips is higher on the weekend, but that's the average. I think the distribution is a key factor, like which roads, like for instance, I would expect that the Gardner and the 401 going to Toronto would be very congested during the weekdays because people are going to work, for example, while the 400 and the QW outbound going to the cottage and going to Niagara Falls on the weekend would be much more heavily congested than everywhere else. So it's not just the average number of trips, it's like the destination of those trips and the roads that will be congested could be very different.
So
I'm wondering if you got into that, like looking at not just the trip generation, but also the assignment. Where is the congestion?
yes, so I think part of the one matrix to answer like that is not only the trip rates, but also the distance traveled. Because it's pretty natural that if they're gonna travel long distance, they will have more the tendencies to use provincial highways and Gardner expressways with higher capacity. And I have empirical evidence that the travel distance is also longer on Saturday. So I can share if you don't mind. But should I take this like become a like very lengthy discussion, or should we
Yeah,
discuss that like
we still have 3 minutes.
hang on? Okay. So
I'm
just
not
give
sure
me
if the
one
length
moment.
is the issue, the length of the trip. I think it's the nature of the trip is more of an issue, like recreational. I'm going somewhere with the family, so we're not going to take transit on the weekend and so on.
Yes, but there is pretty minimum number of working trips on Saturday. So
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying, that it's the nature of the trip that dictates that we use the car on the weekend more, and also the nature of the destination dictates using the car
okay,
more.
can you guys see my screen? I'm
Yes.
sharing a table from the this is the paper that I just presented, case study 1. So this is trip distance. So it's also pretty clear that Saturday has the longest trip distance traveled, and is much longer than the average during weekdays. So it's pretty clear that people are traveling more and longer on Saturday. So
Yeah.
and like anecdotally, like every Saturday I'm stuck on Highway 7. That is, the traffic is more congested than my weekday trips. So I think this is the new normal, and less people are paying attention, but we have to start like paying attention to it and start serious discussion on how we want to build our infrastructure to cope with this.
Yes, I agree 100%. Your findings are very interesting. I'm just encouraging you to look at all these numbers on a map as opposed
Oh
to
yeah. I
averages on
will,
a table.
and yes, I will, and I will also look at the activity purposes,
Yeah.
and with their mode choice together. And this is exactly why we are promoting week-long ABMs instead of the single-day ABMs that we are relying on today.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Professor Zahir, and thank you, Kelly. I think now we will